everybody. My name is Pastor Libby Tedder Hugus, and I am a community of doubters and called the table. We are a community that created an inclusive space for the spiritually curious and the hungry to join us in the pursuit of taking good action on behalf of those that we love right here in Casper and beyond. So it's Easter Monday, and I wanted to share a few thoughts with us this morning about where we find ourselves in the middle of this global pandemic. And so the interesting thing about what I want to share with you this morning is it's something that the original version I actually wrote and reflected on 5 years ago when the table was just beginning its journey as a fresh expression of the possibility of what church could be here in our town. And yet, as I went back to read those words, I found them as relevant and helpful as ever as we find ourselves here thinking about what it means to be alive during this odd time in the year 2020. So, this morning I wanted to just share a few thoughts with you and would love to hear your reflections after you have the opportunity or as you watch along with us this morning. So, here is an Easter Monday sermon. Empty tomb. Now what? Let's talk frankly for a moment about what Easter is not. Here's the deal, y'all. Easter is not about where we go when we die. And really, Easter isn't necessarily about happy endings. One of the folks who wrote down the story of Jesus and attempted to make sense out of it very soon after his physical presence on earth was a guy named Mark. Mark's version of the story couldn't be more clear on this point. The conclusion of the retelling of Jesus' life is abrupt and troubling. Mark's gospel does not include an appearance from Jesus after his death, no commission to go and make disciples, only a frightfully empty tomb. Some strange dude in a white robe was there to confirm it, and the terrified disciples fled from the scene. They were literally scared speechless. So, what is this? This feels like the opposite of your typical Easter story. Isn't Easter about glorious hallelujahs and triumphant fist pumps and victorious renditions of Up from the Grave He Arose? I, for one, am really glad that it's Mark's gospel that we are reading, gathered here virtually around the table on this Easter Monday of the year 2020. We're a community that has worked to create an inclusive space for doubters and disciples together, meaning that we have endeavored to never hold believing hostage for belonging. You get to belong with us, whether belief in God or Jesus or religion is at all your thing. Mark, I think, as a storyteller, is a great fit as a companion for us this year. As a community, as we try to consider and figure out what Easter is and what it is not. Especially when we ask, what is Easter supposed to mean in light of this strange, bewildering, discouraging, overwhelming experience of this very destructive global pandemic? The way that Mark tells it, it seems to be written for the little bit of doubter and disciple that exists within each of us. Easter is not about easy answers or clear-cut assumptions. So, with that in mind, let's take a good, honest look at Mark's version of this resurrection story. We will look at what most biblical scholars agree is the original ending to Mark's gospel. According to the earliest manuscripts available, which is through verse 8 of chapter 16, the rest of this chapter contains additions from the 2nd century after Jesus had died. The gospel writer Mark specifically names 3 women who remained faithful to Jesus longer than any of the other disciples: Mary Magdalene, Mary the mother of James, and Salome. Imagine the courage and determination it would have taken those women to go out after dark when the Sabbath was over to collect the appropriate spices for burial, a tradition in Hebrew funeral rites, and then to rise early on the day after the Sabbath and head for Jesus' tomb. This was a violent, uncertain point in Jerusalem's history. Nothing was guaranteed, not least of which was their safety. It was they, the women, who watched in agony the death of their hopeful Messiah, the one that they were just beginning to allow themselves to believe, just maybe would bring about the transformation of this broken world that they and their entire nation had so desperately longed for. It was they, the women, who stayed all the way through the cruel and gruesome crucifixion until they could follow Jesus' body and see where he was buried. Jesus died on a Friday. The Sabbath that followed the day after Jesus' death by crucifixion must have been one of the darkest days for all of his followers, and especially these women whose beloved Jesus had been so devastatingly stolen from them in his prime, dashing any hopes that they had for current or future salvation, restoration, or change. It was their traditional role as women to anoint a body with perfumes and spices, but they did not have the time before the Sabbath began on that Friday at sunset to properly prepare Jesus' body. They must have felt such a heavy, powerful sense of incompleteness, such a profound lack of closure. Their work was not yet done. And because of the Sabbath, from sundown Friday through sundown Saturday, they were forced to wait. It was they, the women, who rose early enough on Sunday after the Sabbath to purchase those spices necessary for the final step in burial. The step meant to ward off the stench of death, which realistically had already probably taken hold over the course of the last 36 hours. But the women went to the tomb anyway, to finish the work, to find some closure, to come to terms with this wrench in their lives and in the history of their people. And by the way, where the heck were the dudes who were usually found at the head of the pack, leading the way with bravado and confidence? In Mark's retelling, they haven't been seen since Thursday night when Jesus was betrayed and arrested, and when Peter outright denied even knowing Jesus to begin with. The only ones left in this weird, trauma-rife grave space were those who, in the course of daily life, tended to the unseemly and the unnecessary. Cooking, cleaning, grieving, bearing children, perfuming bodies, the ascribed custodians of the crucifixion, the trash-collecting body bearers of Easter. We have to be really careful not to rush to fill in the gaps of what feels like a very desolate and despairing end to Mark's version of the story. We have to work through our own pre-understandings or assumptions of the Easter story in order to really listen to how Mark describes this. How these women, and the first ones to hear it from the women, would have perceived this empty tomb event. For those women disciples who first came to that tomb, worried about how they would roll the stone away that covered the entrance, and then to find it empty and encounter that stranger in white who tells them Jesus isn't in the tomb, it's empty, and that Jesus has been raised up and will meet them in Galilee. That whole empty tomb experience might not have been immediately good news to them. I mean, imagine the confusion. Imagine the uncertainty and the doubt that would have racked even those first witnesses who came upon that empty tomb. All of the disciples, and especially the women who followed Jesus, had begun to allow the hope of God's promised new reality to sink into their consciousness. They had opened their hearts just a crack and begun to believe that God's dream for the world may have actually broken free in the world, that there might actually be good news for the poor after all, that the captives and the prisoners would be released from their cages, that the blind would see, that the year of God's favor might reverse all of the injustices that they, especially as women, faced in their daily lives. Leading up to finding that tomb empty, over the course of 1 week, they had watched their beloved rabbi or teacher publicly claim kingship over the Jewish nation, publicly renounce the corruption of the temple where the Jewish nation worshipped, clash openly with the authorities there, face betrayal at the hands of one of his own disciples, one of their travel companions, and be unjustly condemned to death by imperial powers. Before they found the tomb empty, these women had watched his cruel crucifixion from start to finish. He had died the death of a condemned criminal, when all he had done was love until his dying breath. They followed him all the way to his tomb and back again after the Sabbath to finish the death preparations. Their hearts and their minds must have been riddled with confusion that early morning as they approached the tomb, only to find it empty. If we were to share stories around the table today of experiences that we've had with the passing of our loved ones, we would all admit that facing death is inevitably complex. Grief is always at the forefront, of course, but sometimes less mentionable feelings swirl beneath the surface, including relief. While the grief of death is real, we can also experience relief that the burdens attached to caring for and cleaning up after death are gone now. It's probably the case that the women who bravely and courageously made their way to Jesus' tomb that early morning after the Sabbath were no exception to this feeling of relief. As much as relationship to Jesus had ushered in the hope of some kind of new reality on this earth, it had also become readily apparent that following Jesus was costly. Jesus was not shy about that cost with his disciples. In fact, the way that Mark tells the story, he narrates that Jesus discussed very openly his prediction that he would suffer, be rejected, and killed. Jesus' own words to his followers revealed that following him and the promise of God's rule on this earth meant picking up their crosses to follow him, that those who wanted to save their life would lose it, and those who would lose their life for his sake and for the sake of this good news would be able to save it. So to a degree, these women, as deeply grieved as they were, may have been feeling relieved that they were off the costly hook of discipleship. Relieved that the burden of being followers of this teacher, Jesus, this revolutionary, were lifted now, vanished into death's dark mystery. These women's whole world had already been flipped upside down once that week by the devastation of the death of their beloved Jesus, the one that they hoped would save them. With heavy hearts and minds reeling, they approached his tomb to make peace with his death. And instead, they were again thrown a giant curveball with the announcement from the unnamed young guy dressed in dazzling white, he's not here. He's going ahead of you to Galilee. Whatever life force was present when Jesus was alive, all the promised transformation, all the powerful healing presence, all that movement for good had been released from the jaws of death into the world, beckoning the women again to follow Jesus. It's no wonder that the empty tomb was not immediately good news to those faithful yet understandably complex women disciples. The empty tomb meant that God's dream was alive, that God was not dead, that the reign of love and peace and justice that had begun in Jesus' work on this earth had been unequivocally released from the chains of death, brought back to life somehow, and it was moving forward just like Jesus said it would. It's no wonder that the women disciples were seized by terror and amazement, as Mark tells us, that they said nothing to anyone and fled the empty tomb because they were afraid. The empty tomb meant that these women and all truly committed disciples would have to take to heart Jesus' word after all. If anyone wants to become my followers, Jesus said, Let them deny themselves and take up their cross and follow me. For those who want to save their life will lose it, and those who lose their life for my sake and for the sake of the gospel will save it. For what will it profit them to gain the whole world and forfeit their life? Indeed, what can they give in return for their life? Those who are ashamed of me and my words in this adulterous and sinful generation, of them the Son of Man will also be ashamed when he comes in the glory of his Father with the holy angels. As these women disciples had come to know intimately, there is a real tension in following Jesus. It is inherently life giving and transformative and fundamentally challenging at all levels, in all spheres. Being loved by God and loving God in return is directly tied to the risk of loving our neighbor. If we were to run a religious benefit cost analysis, disciples are always tempted to dissolve this tension between accepting the love of God and being willing to love others accordingly. Dissolving this tension is as simple as accepting the death of such love in order to avoid the cost of really taking it to heart. Or is it that simple? This is the crux of discipleship. This is the terror and amazement of an empty tomb. The transformative power of God's love was not silenced in the tomb. It has been released from the jaws of death, and God's Spirit meets us in the bewilderment of the empty tomb to tell us, He's been raised. He's not here. Look, this is the place where they laid him, but go tell the others, He's going ahead of you. You will see him, just as He told you. Empty tomb, doubters, and disciples look like this. Like being shocked speechless when we realize that death has not conquered life, that love wins, that God has overcome the power of oppression and injustice, and that the dream of God for the reign of love on earth has only just begun. Empty tomb, doubters, and disciples own our terror and our fear when we come to terms with the cost of discipleship. That the tension of choosing to follow this servant king whose mission is radical and revolutionary and demanding and costly. Empty tomb doubters and disciples learn to find their voice again and dare to tell others what they know, that death does not win in the end. It does not conquer life or love. Empty tomb doubters and disciples dare to affirm that the kingdom of God, the dream God dreams for our world of restoration, it's already here and it's already now. That we are the ones who share the responsibility to share the good news with the poor, to give sight to the blind, to set the captives free and release the prisoners, to usher in the year of God's favor and justice on earth, to restore the brokenhearted, those ravished by a vicious, heartless global pandemic and the aftermath of its virus. Easter is not about where we go when we die. And really, Easter is not about happy endings. Easter is about an empty tomb some 2,000 years ago that unleashed the power of the risen life of Jesus, beckoning us to follow him because Jesus has gone ahead of us and we will see him just as he told us. We will see him in the hungry, the thirsty, the caged. We will see him in the sharing of the bread and the drinking of the wine. We will know him in the friendship and nourishment around the table, in the taking, blessing, breaking, and giving away of the bread of life, to the hungriest and to the most starved for love. We will see him in the faces of the grieved and the devoted because of COVID-19. We will see him in the faces of the brave frontline healthcare workers. We will see him in the faces of the poorest who are first to suffer when economies collapse. We will see him in the faces of the dogged and brave leaders seeking a way forward. We will see him in the movements to spread love first, like the Neighborhood of Love Facebook group that is right now meeting direct needs in our city of Casper. You see, the world will know that we are empty tomb doubters and disciples by our love, which cannot be caged by any tomb or any global pandemic. Being loved by God and loving God in return is directly tied to the risk of loving our neighbor. They will know we are fearless by our love. May we go now to love and serve each other, caught in this never before seen or heard of or experienced global pandemic, so that those to whom love is a stranger will find in us generous friends.